All Pendolas originate from the Rapallo area, which is in Liguria, a region in northwest Italy. The Pendola name has Germanic roots. The Lombards were a Germanic tribe that overran Liguria in the 7th century. They later settled in the Liguria Valley, bringing their customs and language. The Pendola village, which is near Rapallo, is just a few houses on the bank of a river and dates back to medieval times. The name Pendola comes from the ancient German word for strip of land, likely referring to the strip of land along the river where the Pendola village is located. The Pendola village is situated in the Fontana Buona Valley, which is a long valley that lies from Chiavari on the coast to the northwest. Although this valley was a backwards and agricultural area until the beginning of the 20th century, today this area is dotted with small businesses. Beginning in the 19th century, many people from this area began emigrating to America, mostly the United States. Starting in the 12th century, families began moving over the hills from the valley to the coast. However, most Pendola families never reached Rapallo on the coast. Instead, they settled on the slopes of the hill facing the sea and formed the village of San Maurizio. In the 16th century, 26 Pendola families were in San Maurizio, which comprised a third of the entire population. In the 15th and 16th centuries, there was a movement of people from northern Italy to Sicily. These were mostly merchants, but also poor people who headed to Sicily in search of work and a better life. The immigrants arrived in Palermo, the main port and capital of the island. Many settled in San Giacomo alla Marina parish starting in the early 16th century. Eventually, many of the Pendola families settled in Salemi, which is in Trapani province, and Menfi, which is in Agrigento province. Several Pendola marriages have been found in the Salemi church archives starting in the early 17th century. This was a time of growth for Salemi, and the Pendolas likely were greatly involved in its growth. At the beginning of the 18th century, the Pendolas started settling in Menfi, which was a small farming community. Seeking out greater opportunities, many Pendola secured land and built a home. A Pietro Pendola, probably from Salemi, was found in the 1715 Menfi census. The Pendolas built strong and lasting roots in Menfi. In subsequent decades, some of these families moved to surrounding communities, such as Sambuca, Burgio, Sciacca, and Montevago. Today, there are shops of businesses in these Sicilian towns, many of them named Pendola. These industrious and productive families create a conspicuous presence. Indeed, today there probably are more Pendolas in this area than in Rapallo itself. During the middle of the 19th century, people from northern Italy began emigrating to North America. Many came to make their fortunes in California after the 1849 gold rush. A Number of passenger lists for ships arriving in New York City contained several Rapallo Pendolas. During the end of the 19th century, Pendolas in Sicily began traveling to America. This time they did not come for gold, but for work in factories in New York, or picking cotton on large estates in the South. After several years of living hard lives, they quickly integrated into the American society and produced a new generation of full-blooded Americans. Here are some pictures of Pendola families from Memphis who settled in Illinois. Benedetto Pendola was born in 1836 in San Maurizio di Monte. At age 20, he crossed the Atlantic Ocean and eventually settled in the United States. In the state of Nevada, he searched for gold, worked as a postmaster, and later owned a saloon. He later lived in Visalia and Bakersfield, California, where he owned a small shop. In 1922, his tragic murder by a robber made a sensation in the press. Another immigrant from Rapallo was Giuseppe Pendola, who enlisted in the Arkansas Regiment of the Confederate Army. While fighting in the American Civil War, he was taken prisoner. He was later returned in exchange for Union prisoners. After the war, he settled in the state of Louisiana. Pietro Giuseppe Pendola, who was born in Montevago, Sicily, settled in Peoria in the early 20th century. He was a sculptor and worked for the Peoria Stone and Marble Company. Pietro built his own home in Peoria on Madison Avenue using a lot of scraps of stone and marble that he obtained on various work projects. Using his skills as a sculptor, Pietro created the fireplace for his Peoria home as well as ornaments for the exterior of the house. Unfortunately, he lost this home during the Great Depression. This house later lay abandoned for many years. A few years ago, the house was renovated by an organization that is a strong supporter of the Peoria Police Department. In memory of Pietro's son Salvatore, who was a police officer, the renovated house will always be the home of a Peoria police officer and family. So 100 years after its construction, the house, built by Pietro Giuseppe Pendola, will have a new life. Many Pendolas from Rapallo emigrated to South America. Chile and Argentina were the most common destinations. Many of these immigrants were small merchants in Valparaiso and factory workers in Argentina. Their descendants continue to live there today. Immigration from Liguria to South America began as early as 1820, first to Montevideo and later to Buenos Aires and the rest of Argentina. After only a century, Italian became the #1 nationality in Argentina, with some 55% of the population having Italian roots. In 1875, Giovanni Pendola left Rapallo for Argentina. Unlike most of his countrymen, he was a rich man and wanted to make investments in the country. He moved directly to Corrientes in the north with his 4 sons. The provincial government offered tax breaks to investors to encourage growth after the area had been ravaged by war with Paraguay. Giovanni Pendola was not alone. In a few years, flocks of Italians came to Corrientes and other cities and established their institutions, such as the Society for Mutual Help. With this money, Giovanni Pendola opened a bakery, which later expanded into a mill. Here are some ads from a local newspaper. His son continued the business until 1920, when the company unfortunately went broke. The family moved to Bella Vista, a few hundred miles south of Corrientes, and the descendants are still there. Each year in June, Italian immigration is remembered in Argentina. Bernardo Pendola and his son and daughter put on the suit of the first immigrants and parade into the Bella Vista streets. Tommaso Pendola was born in Genoa in 1800. Here is a plate on the house in which he was born. He became a priest and later moved to Siena in the Tuscany region. In Siena, he founded an institute for the education of deaf people. This institution is still active today, helping deaf members of the community. In many Italian towns, like Genoa and Siena, there are also streets named after Tommaso Pendola. Interestingly, Tommaso had a brother named Agostino who wrote drama and poetry. Agostino Pendola also was a printer and had a small shop in Genoa. Here is a book that was printed in his shop. Giovanni Pendola was born in 1836 in Genoa. His father had migrated from San Maurizio dei Monti. In the 1850s, the Genoese Republican movement prepared the young for the battle for the unification of Italy, and Giovanni joined this movement. In May of 1860, he embarked with the thousands of soldiers led by Garibaldi, who sailed to Sicily to free the South, which at the time was a backward kingdom. After disembarking in Marsala, Sicily, the first battle was in Colorafini. The army led by Giuseppe Garibaldi decisively beat the Neapolitan troops of the Bourbon King Francis II. A few months later, the war was over. In March 1861, Italy was a unified country. After the war, Giovanni Pendola went back to Genoa to his work, though he remained active in charitable activities. For instance, in 1883, he helped the sick during a cholera outbreak. As an old man, he retired to Rapallo, where he died in 1907. Here is the first list of the Garibaldini, including Giovanni Pendola. In May 1907, just a few months after Giovanni Pendola's death, a marble plaque was displayed in San Maurizio di Monte by his friends and brother Freemasons from Genoa to remember and honor him. In 1595, Andrea Pendola, a wealthy man from San Maurizio di Monte with no descendants, left in his will that a trust was to be formed to give a dowry to all Pendola daughters. His house is now in ruins, but the trust continued. The latest distribution of the dowry took place in 2015 in Rapallo. Here is a ceremony that took place in the church that involved the mayor of Rapallo and one of the commissioners of the trust, in which the dowry was distributed. As it was the first ceremony after a lapse of 20 years, most of the women were somewhat older. Here is Agostino Pendola recalling the history of the well and its long and respectable tradition. Here's the second commissioner, Paolo Pendola. Here is the mayor concluding the ceremony.